The reviews are in, boys. It's a hit. Whoa! The release of the PlayStation and N64 was both a massive leap forward in technology and scope, and a leap backwards in terms of what developers were accustomed to. 3D was new to everyone, and the rush to master what it could bring to video games led to some breakout hits and a lot of experimentation. It was a wild west for developers, a race to see who could make the biggest worlds, the most standout characters, the craziest amount of collectibles. Anything could happen. Among these games was Crash Bandicoot, the first major success for the modern AAA powerhouse that is Naughty Dog. Crash 1 was relatively held back and conservative compared to other platformers at the time. The areas were all extremely linear, the bosses weren't all that bombastic or intense, and many of the levels were shown from a 2D perspective. Nevertheless, people loved it, simple or not, and excitement for the sequel was palpable back in the day. Everyone was excited for Crash 2. You couldn't take 10 steps around school without hearing kids talk about it. I didn't get my hands on the game until a few years after it had already come out, but that didn't stop me from seeing why the series was so loved in its prime. The improvements that Crash 2 added over Crash 1 were immense, and not just in its scope and visuals. Nearly every single aspect from the original was built upon in ways that didn't seem gimmicky like so many other sequels. Comparing the two games side by side, you can see that the developers knew to add to the foundation that the first game had built, rather than just tacking on new, shallow mechanics. All of this combined makes what I think is one of the best sequels ever made. The first thing that stands out about Crash 2 are its vastly improved visuals and animations. You don't have to go far to see how much better they are. Comparing the first levels of both games just highlights how much more experienced the dev team had gotten over just a single year. The colors pop out more, the environment is a lot more dense and detailed, and I feel like the artists really hit a groove with what they wanted the atmosphere to be like. Next is Crash himself. While he didn't look exactly bad in the original, you can see how adding just a small amount of animation can make a character have a lot more personality. What used to look slightly stiff and awkward now looks smooth and cartoonish like it should. While these small details don't exactly affect the gameplay itself, they can make the player feel like they do. When Crash lands from a jump, you don't want to be thinking, oh, that looked a little bit off. What you want to be thinking is nothing. A game character that moves as you expect them to keeps your mind focused on the gameplay rather than little visual nitpicks, and that's something that Crash 2 definitely does well. Crash animates just how you want him to, and it's a clear improvement from the original. What matters most in a game, though, aren't its animations or visuals, but the gameplay. And when it comes to Cortex Strikes Back, the gameplay is the #1 standout in terms of what's been added and improved. In the first Crash, you were pretty limited when it came to your movement options and attacks. You could only run, jump, and spin. It got the job done, but the skill ceiling was extremely low. The challenge in that game came from timing jumps and knowing when to play the waiting game. Crash 2, on the other hand, has a lot more for the player to mess around with. In addition to everything you had before, you now have crouching, crawling, crouch jumping, sliding, slide spinning, slide jumping, slide spin jumping, and belly flopping. All of these, except for maybe belly flopping, blend together perfectly, letting the player speed through levels in a way that just wasn't possible in Crash 1. Jumps that would not be possible in that game are now easy to pull off if you know what you're doing, and jumps that seem impossible in Crash 2 itself are possible if you know how to take advantage of what the game gives you to work with. I don't want to underemphasize how much I love these additions. The new control options alone make Crash 2 a much better game than the first in my eyes. They could have downgraded everything else, and I would still think that. That's how much I love running around in this game. Lucky for me, though, there are still plenty of other improvements. If you watched my already embarrassing previous video, you might remember me saying how much I love collectibles in 3D platformers. Crash 1 and 2 have their fair share of collectibles, and this is another area that I think Crash 2 trumps the first game in. In both games, there are gems that you earn by breaking every box in a level. In Crash 1, I feel like this is poorly done. Not only do you have to break every box in a level, but you have to do it without dying. This definitely encourages the player to master the level, which is good in a way, but I feel like it goes a step too far in difficulty. I think an appropriate challenge to get the gem would be either breaking all of the boxes or not dying throughout the entire level, not both. Crash 2 does exactly this by getting rid of the mandatory no death rule, but it doesn't stop just there. There are extra gems that you can earn in some levels by beating an extra route that you can only unlock if you get to it without dying, as well as a couple time trials on the jetboard sections. This adds a variety to how you earn extra collectibles without straying from the platforming design of the gameplay, which is the best way to do it. Another new addition to Crash 2 are purple crystals, but they're literally impossible to miss, so I wouldn't really say they're much of an upgrade. Both games also have colored gems, which are a little more important than regular gems because they add extra routes to previous levels when you've collected one. Crash 1 has 6 colored gems, while Crash 2 only has 5, but don't let that make you think the first game is the winner here. To get all of the colored gems in the original, all you have to do is break every box without dying in 6 specific levels, which is what you had to do anyways for the regular gems. Crash 2, on the other hand, has going through secret routes, beating time trials, and breaking no boxes in one level to get all of its colored gems. The methods of getting these are a lot more involved and fun, making them seem a lot more important than they were in the original. Picking one up in Cortex Strikes Back makes you feel like you've solved a little puzzle, rather than just played through a level normally. Music is extremely subjective, so I'm not going to say that Crash 2's soundtrack is an improvement over the first games, but I think it's impossible to deny that they upped the excitement for the sequel. Crash 1's songs are often pretty quiet and laid back, which can work in some situations, but I think the more catchy, cartoonish themes that they made for the second game fits the gameplay and aesthetic better. At the end of the day, it isn't a contest to see which game is better. I actually think Crash 1 is the second best game in the series, right behind Crash 2. It's just incredible to see how much potential the dev team saw for improvements to the base formula. Nothing they added in the transition from the first game to the second game felt tacked on or forced. Everything came together to create a logical evolution to what they had already made. What you have to remember is that this was their first big hit. They hadn't made a name for themselves yet, and they could have easily stuck with what had made them initially successful. But what they ended up doing was going above and beyond. They did exactly what all of the best sequels do. They not only gave players exactly what they wanted, they gave players what they didn't know they wanted. That kind of foresight is nothing short of impressive, and it's what separates the big dogs from the naughty dog. Hey, thanks for watching my video. I'm still trying to figure out a format and tone for these things, so if you have any suggestions or criticisms for what could be changed or improved, post them if you want.